Well, thanks very much, Susan, and thank you all for coming out. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. What I thought I'd talk about tonight is the way that Fitzgerald and Hemingway dealt with their fame, their celebrity. And they both had a difficult time with it, the way they presented themselves. And they have very different public images, but at the same time images that once established proved extremely hard to get rid of. Fitzgerald produced a number of advertisements for himself when his first book came out in 1920. He was only 23 years old. This Side of Paradise, about young people, obviously, and their flaming youth and their reactions against the older generation. And an extraordinarily popular book. And he had been struggling with it for some time. It had taken him 2.5, 3 years to get the book written. He'd had to change things around a great deal. It wasn't accepted for a long while. And when it finally was, of course, he was wonderfully excited. But when Scribner's finally did decide to publish it, his editor, Max Perkins, said, well, you've been in the advertising game long enough to know what to do. Well, he'd been in the advertising game for 4 months. But anyway, he did produce just a sample of the way he presented himself at the beginning of his career, a document that he was to deliver at the American Booksellers Association. What he said to the booksellers, what he lied about, was that he produced the book with almost no trouble at all. He said it took him 3 months to conceive it, 3 months to write it, rather, 3 minutes to conceive it, and all his life to collect all the data in it. He also added that as a writer, he called the writing the process of composition a substitute form of dissipation. And he picked up that theme later on in his talk, and signing off reverted to the dissipation motif. So he says, so gentlemen, speaking to the booksellers, consider all the cocktails mentioned in this book drunk by me as a toast to the booksellers convention. Well, the image he's presenting, obviously, is that of a brash young genius who's tossed off a novel as cavalierly as the people, the characters in the book, toss back their drinks. His appeal is to a youthful audience who will presumably be delighted to join him in repudiating the outmoded mores of the past. At the same time, the author said he wanted more than immediate reward, because he also said in that same speech that he was writing for the youth of his own generation, the critics of the next, and the schoolmasters of ever afterward. So one eye is cocked on the sales figures, and the other looks for approval from the critics and even from posterity. By any standards, the book was a great success. It sold better than any other Fitzgerald novel while he was alive. But it also presented him in a somewhat unpleasant light to a lot of people. His friend Ring Lardner, for example, effectively reduced the image as he presented himself by saying, Mr. Fitzgerald sprang into fame with his novel This Side of Paradise when only 3 years old, and wrote the entire book with only one hand. More telling and more lasting was what Edna St. Vincent Millay had to say about him in 1922. She said that he reminded her of a stupid old woman who'd been given a valuable diamond and didn't know what to do with it. And Edmund Wilson, who was at that time, I think, married to her, certainly sleeping with her, agreed that there was symbolic truth in that, for as he said of Fitzgerald, who had been a class behind him at Princeton and someone he always looked down on as an intellectual inferior. He said he was like that ignorant woman in the sense that he'd been granted imagination without intellectual control of it, the desire for beauty without an aesthetic ideal, and a gift for expression without very many ideas to express. Well, this is a terrible put-down for supposedly a good friend, and it stuck to Fitzgerald's reputation throughout his life and for a good many years after that. And then another problem, of course, was the way that Fitzgerald and Scott and Zelda behaved themselves. In the years between 1920 and 1924, they lived either in Westport, Connecticut, or out in Long Island, with frequent sojourns into New York City, the publicity capital of the world, and where they were interviewed at nightclubs, and all of their doings were reported, including their famous leap into the Pulitzer fountain outside the Plaza Hotel at midnight. So clearly Fitzgerald was dwindling into a celebrity instead of a writer, and not a celebrity to whom particular deference need be paid. In the public mind, he was indelibly associated with the younger generation determined to defy its elders, and it didn't help that he titled his first two books Flappers and Philosophers and Tales of the Jazz Age, though Max Perkins didn't like that title. He didn't want to associate his writer with the Jazz Age, but Fitzgerald always was thereafter. Writing, in other words, seemed for Fitzgerald a casual occupation that in no way inhibited the pursuit of a pleasurable and carefree existence, but the problem being if he refused to take himself seriously, he could hardly expect others to do so. He was, at the time of his, throughout his 20-year career, as I say, and even he died at 44, quite young in Hollywood. And despite having written some wonderfully complex and moving stories and two of the great novels of the century, Gatsby and Tenders the Night, books that brilliantly portrayed the dark side of the culture he inhabited, Fitzgerald drifted from fame into oblivion. Bud Schulberg, when he was invited to work on a screenplay with Fitzgerald in 1938, was surprised to hear that he was still alive. And when he did die 2 years later, the obituaries characterized him almost universally as a mere chronicler of the Jazz Age. It took another decade for his reputation to begin to recover, and to many casual observers to this day, he remains a basically larky and unserious writer. Hemingway's story is somewhat different. He is, I suppose, the famous American writer of the 20th century, and perhaps of all time. Mark Twain might be his rival. Even those who've never read a word that he wrote are aware of his presence in the world of celebrity, a rugged macho figure called Papa with a signature white beard. The outpouring of recognition that followed his suicide on the morning of July 2nd, 1961, nearly obliterated the boundaries of space and time. His passing was memorialized by the Kremlin and the White House, and the Vatican, and the bull rings of Spain. As almost one editorial observed, as though the 20th century itself had come to a sudden, violent, and premature end. Hemingway, like many middle-class boys, was brought up on Horatio Alger novels, in which worthy, healthy-minded, hard-working lads rapidly ascend the ladder of success. Such rewards presumably lay within the reach of any youth willing to apply himself. The goal, obviously, in an American culture was success. And in our culture, success amounted to rising above the station you were born into. Or, to put it more baldly, doing better than your father had. If your father was a butcher, you should own the meat market. But to outdo one's forebears generation after generation was simply impossible. And only in a society of consistently rising expectations like the Progressive Era in late 19th century America could such a doctrine have taken hold, and only in a society as determined to cling to its progressive past could have continued to exert its power. So money then was the standard by which success could most easily be measured, but it wasn't enough to inherit it or to have it descend from the trees. You had to make it, and others had to take notice. Particularly in the other-directed United States, recognition of one's accomplishment became an essential ingredient in the stew pot of success. No wonder then that the culture descended to ostentatious displays of wealth, or in the parlance of Thorstein Veblen, to commodity fetishism and conspicuous consumption.